have a cell phone. So we were fortunate enough to have Dirk Krueger. So I want to keep it short because I don't want to cut too much in his time, who's done a large amount of work in macroeconomics, dynamic models. He's interested these days in healthcare outcomes, so he's moved into that field. He's a pen. We're especially fortunate because he just injured his knee, he had an operation, so nevertheless he came down and flew down, okay? So I told him I wouldn't have done it, but he's done it. He's managing editor of the Restart, so talk to him, be nice to him. And today we talk about, no, isn't that what you should say?
Yeah,
nice people, okay? So today we will talk about a dynamic model about intergenerational redistribution. And so you have an hour and a half, and I apologize for being slightly late. And it's all yours.
Okay, thanks a lot. Yeah, so this is joined with Andy Glover, John Heathcote, and Victor Rios Roll, and this is sort of all people that at some point or another of their life have been in Minnesota, and so this is going to be a fairly Minnesota-style paper, and you will see various aspects of that. And in a way, so this is intergenerational redistribution of the Great Recession. It's a very simple question. Two observations about the Great Recession. Income fell a lot relative to trend. That's well known, I guess that's why we call it the Great Recession, and stayed persistently low. Second observation, if you look at a broad measure of asset prices, they fell a lot and they fell even more, significantly more, and remained depressed as well. This was an aggregate shock. Since it's an aggregate shock, somebody has to eat up the losses of this aggregate shock. And the main question is, was the shock mainly affecting the welfare of young or old households living through the Great Recession? And what I will try to convince you, and this will be somewhat controversial, is that all indicators that you usually read about indicate that the Great Recession was awful for the young. We want to push one mechanism that provides a silver lining for the young that suggests that maybe the Great Recession was not as awful as you might think for the young, whereas for the elderly, unfortunately I have nothing positive to say about the Great Recession. This is going to be bad. For the young, it's going to be not so great as well, but not as bad as you thought.
How about those in the middle? Poor Vernon.
Yeah. Those in the middle are somewhere a convex combination of the two. So let me just show you two motivational facts. So this is going to be a macro paper that takes heterogeneity on the micro level somewhat seriously. Most of my work hopefully takes it much more serious. Today the heterogeneity will be strictly between different age groups, and I will treat age groups within age groups. I will treat the population as fairly homogeneous. So I will show you two macro facts about incomes and asset prices, and then three micro facts that just plots what happened to different households of different ages in the Great Recession. And from there, the answer that I will obtain through some sophisticated plumbing in the model will probably be already fairly transparent. Then the rest is just writing down the model, putting some numbers, putting on the computer and computing the numbers. But I think once I've shown you the data, it's going to be pretty transparent what will happen. So let me show you one plot with macro data. So this is starting from 2007 up until 2016. Two things, income and the value of assets. So some steps went into this. So the blue line, that is GDP per capita relative to 2% long-run growth rate. So the assumption here is that in 2007, the US economy was nicely chugging along at a 2% per capita growth trend. And the blue line is what happened in deviation from that trend. What you see is that relative to trend, somewhere between 2007 and 2009, the US economy hit a rock, and income per capita dropped 10% relative to trend and has not recovered relative to trend, certainly not until 2016. The most recent years show a little bit of recovery relative to trend, but this was a fairly massive, fairly rapid decline relative to trend, 10%, much larger than the other post-war recessions that we saw. And what is important for our story, it was a very persistent decline. We have not seen much of a recovery relative to trend. And that's well known, and that's I guess what is the observation of the Great Recession, and the fact that things have not recovered. Some people give that a name and call it secular stagnation, this idea that maybe we are permanently on a lower growth trajectory. I will not take a strong stance on that. For us, what is important is that there was a rapid decline, and it stayed down for a very substantial period of time. So these income losses, since this was income per capita, somebody has to bear the losses in terms of welfare from these. The second thing, and that's maybe not so well known, is the red line. So this is net worth, where I define net worth as the value of all assets minus the value of all liabilities. And the key components of assets are not only financial assets, but very important for our story, these are also housing assets, so the value of your real estate, minus all liabilities means significantly minus mortgages. And again, this is constructed assuming that in 2007 we were in trend, and relative to trend, to 2% growth trend, asset values fell by about 30% very rapidly and stayed down for a very substantial period of time before slowly recovering. And this drop initially was mainly driven by financial assets. The stock market tanked very, very deeply, but fairly quickly recovered. The fact that this stays down very substantially has to do with the fact that house prices also fell by a lot, nationwide, somewhere between 20 and 30%, and that recovery was much, 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 much slower. So the fact that this remains low for a significant period of time, you might say, well, wait a second, don't we know in 2011 the stock market was as high as it was prior to the Great Recession? That is true. But when you look at houses, both residential real estate as well as commercial real estate, big drop in those prices and persistent decline from that point. So the observation here is lots of losses in terms of income, the loss in terms of asset valuations driven by asset prices, perhaps 3 times as large, 10%, 30% if you want to keep a rough number in your head. The question is, who bore the losses associated from that? In order to answer that question first, I will have to tell you who owns the incomes and who owns the assets across the age distribution. But the basic upshot will be that I will show you that incomes are mainly owned by the young, especially future incomes are mainly owned by the young. They drop by 10%. Who owns assets? Mainly middle-aged and old households. Assets fall by 3 times as much as income. So therefore, a priori, other things equal, you would expect that it's elderly households significantly hit by the Great Recession because of the large decline in asset prices. In fact, if these asset prices do recover, as the data suggests, then being young, don't having a lot of assets, but wanting to buy assets for your future consumption of housing and retirement consumption, the Great Recession might actually be great news to you because the assets that you like are temporarily cheap for you to buy, and you have to evaluate that against the massive losses that you have on the labor market. So what is the silver lining? The silver lining for the young is the young like assets on the buying side because they like houses directly, and they like financial assets for their retirement. These assets, because of the Great Recession, are temporarily cheap, and even though they lost significant amounts of labor income, as long as they can remain to borrow against their future labor income, the relatively cheap asset prices during the Great Recession might mitigate the welfare losses that the young had from the labor. So that's, in a nutshell, the story I'm trying to tell quantitatively. Now, if you get too excited as a young person and think there's going to be massive welfare gains from the Great Recession, that won't happen because the labor market is just too awful for the young. But relative to a world where only the labor market Great Recession has happened, this asset drop and subsequent partial recovery will tell us that the welfare gains are significantly smaller for the young than based on the labor market story alone. You would suggest almost welfare neutral. So that's the argument I want to make in a nutshell. In order to convince you of that, I now want to show you 3 sets of facts from microdata, where I take the US population, I will divide them into 6 age groups, and I will tell you what assets and what incomes are owned by what part of the population by age, and how risky household portfolios are with respect to age. And then I will also show you how bad the labor market was in the Great Recession for the young and for the elderly. Those 3 observations, which will suggest that there were massive differences across age groups, suggest that the welfare consequences from the Great Recession might potentially be varying quite dramatically across the aged population. The rest of the paper is then simply trying to write an almost accounting framework that tries to turn these empirical numbers into welfare numbers through the use of a utility function and some sort of substantial calibration work. But qualitatively, once you see the pictures, you know what will be going on. I should say from the outset, just to fix expectation, I have nothing at all intelligent to say about what caused the Great Recession. So in my world, the Great Recession will happen as a function of an exhaustion or shock. I will make the Great Recession in terms of the income losses look like the Great Recession in the data by construction. I will write down a model where asset prices are going to be endogenous. We will work hard to make asset prices look like the red line in the data. That will be reasonably hard to do. And then the question is, once I engineer a Great Recession that exogenously has drops in incomes, and endogenously has drops in asset prices like the red line, once I have a utility function in a general equilibrium model, I can answer the hypothetical question you pose to every household of every generation. How much would you be willing to pay not to have lived through the Great Recession relative to having experienced it? And that welfare number will be my measure of how painful the Great Recession is. The main upshot is it's going to be very large for the elderly, it's going to be reasonably small for the young, and that all comes from asset price declines and subsequent potential recovery.
Do we have any data on whether the young in reality purchased more of these assets during this period?
They don't have to purchase more assets. As long as the prices dropped a lot, it's not that they have to expend a larger share of their income on these assets. But one prediction that the model has is that the wealth distribution should shift towards the young, because these are the guys at the buying end of the portfolio. I will show you data that support that prediction. So if you look at wealth shares across the Great Recession, relative to 2007, which is just the onset of the Great Recession, that's going to be my starting year. Initially, because the young had riskier portfolios, their wealth share drops, but then it very strongly recovers. In fact, overshoots relative to the initial period in 2007, and that's sort of the core prediction of the model. Now, ideally, you would want to have microdata looking at home ownership rates for the young and whether those have massively increased. And there's sort of there the evidence is more mixed.
I can't quite put my finger on what bothers me about it, but using 2007 as the baseline, when it's the peak of the bubble, to define the point where the trend should continue, and then evaluating the change in asset values relative to that feels...
Yeah, so I think from the perspective of this paper, it doesn't matter in the following sense. I will take 2007 as my starting point. I will have a stochastic process that will tell you what happens after that, how we got to 2007, whether this was a bubbly period before, or whether this was some nice performance in terms of productivity in the housing market. I don't think I have to take a stance on, because I have no theory for how we get to 2007. I have a theory of what happens between 2007 and so forth. The only point that is important for me is that once we had the drop in 2009, which will look exactly like in the data, in expectation, things will recover. That part is important for my story, and that is something we could debate about. So what I will model is a process that's partially mean reverting, and the mean reverting part, that's important. Where we started in 2007, whether this is normal times or an exuberant period of time, that doesn't matter, because I will take 2007 as initial condition. So for example, I will take the distribution of wealth and incomes directly from the data and impute it directly in the model. What is important is potential for recovery, not so much how we got to 2007. Now, the one thing I wanted to make clear though, you use the bubble word. I will use an asset pricing model where asset prices will move without the bubble component, and therefore anything that has to do with asset prices will be fully rational without bubble component. So you might not like my asset pricing model because it does not have the bubble component. The fact that 2007 might have been not trend, but a special year, that I think is not important. Because again, we take 2007 as the base year, and we want to theorize about what happened from that point.
Could I push on that point just a bit? So, I mean, you know, a lot of this has to do with the role of expectations. if smart money had understood that there was going to be, like there was a bubble, then you wouldn't necessarily think your assets as being continuing on that trend. You would assume that the trend would be lower. So, it's been a while, so I don't know, I don't remember exactly the feelings at the time, so how many people thought that there was a bubble, and so.
Yeah, so the way this is going to play out in the model is that in 2007, there's a very good chance that things will continue. But this is going to be a full rational expectations model. Even in 2007, everybody in the economy, in my model at least, understood that there's a small, non-trivial, but small probability of the Great Recession happening. And once the Great Recession happens, there's sort of a third thing that can happen that's really nasty. Something like the Great Depression, and that will stoke people with a lot of fear, and that's going to be important for asset pricing. So, but the assumption here is that there is a small probability that the Great Recession happens. So it was not completely unforeseen, and asset prices in 2007 reflect the chance of a potential downturn. And the portfolios that we will have in the model will reflect those beliefs as well. Now, one thing where the model is qualitatively does quite well, but quantitatively overshoots, the portfolio allocations in the data look as if households were less afraid of a recession coming than what I will impute them to be in the model. In the data, the portfolios look just fine. In the model, given the probabilities of a recession, there's going to be a very strong age gradient that says, I understand, Great Recession is coming. Who should hold the risky stock? Who should hold the safe stock?
So, I mean, if you're doing a welfare analysis, you're trying to figure out who's harmed by this. We might not feel as bad about someone losing value in their assets from 2008 on if they had a great run-up right before that over time. So it is sort of relevant what the story is of what happens before that, right? Unless we can identify different incidents of whatever gains existed before that and losses afterward.
Not for the precise welfare question I will ask, but then you might object to my welfare. My welfare theory is whatever happened before 2007, it's great for the old guys that they had a nice run in the stock market. I'm measuring the welfare losses from that point on.
Okay.
There's an equivalent question that I can also I could ask that question in the model easily. That says, let's rewind to 1980 and let's ask the old people, would you rather have a nice run of 30 periods of good asset performance and then the Great Recession, relative to a world where everything was dull and nothing ever happened? That's a question I could answer easily as well, because I have the utility function for all of that. The welfare conclusions for the old would be very substantially different, obviously. Now, so if you want to take away one sort of welfare message, the fact that in my model the old do pretty poorly is almost mechanical, and I want to stress to one. The fact that the young households do significantly better than based on the labor market you would expect, that's the main take-home message I want to stress. Because as I said, for the old, I've written down a model where nothing good can happen, and clearly the calculations would be different if you start in the 1980, which we know because we can easily do.
Just a quick comment. If the Federal Reserve is thought of as a smart money, they had a conference the second quarter of 2005, right after the open market committee met, and the conference was, is there a housing bubble? And the answer, yes. Will the consequences be hard? No. And what was the evidence? $3 trillion came off the value of stocks in 2000, 2001, and it had hardly any impact. And you believe how little understanding there is in that. I mean, housing they didn't even bother to separate housing.
So in fact, that's a very important point in the sense that I think we could not write the paper in this way if housing was not part of the red line. So the fact that this stayed low for a substantial period of time is crucially depending on housing. When I will show you portfolio allocations between the young and the old, and who holds risk and who holds safe stuff, it's absolutely crucial that housing is part of net worth. Because if you take away housing, your conclusion would be very, very, very different. So in a way, the Great Recession, for most people, is a Great Recession, apart from the labor market, because of the fact that house valuations, financial stuff, was deep, but recovered fairly quickly. So we think of housing as a very important part of the story.
Yeah, the thing missing in the model, and it relates to what the difference that William was saying, is simply the effect on financial institutions and the near collapse of a variety of institutions that occurred.
Well, so I mean, in a way, so
And that's basically, financial recessions are much deeper and longer international data
yeah.
than just.
No. In fact, I mean, this is in a very reduced form. So the way I will calibrate the model, I will make the Great Recession not my typical recession, but a much deeper recession. Now, again, my statement that I have no clue what caused the Great Recession, or I will not entertain sort of theorizing about it. I will be driven by a shock, and for what I'm up to, it doesn't matter whether that was a financial or a real shock, as long as it reduced incomes a lot and asset prices by even a lot more. And that's something that I will generate. I will do that in a fairly reduced form. I fully agree that the standard recessions, the sort of shallow recessions, would not accord well with my theory. And that's why all these small business cycles we actually lump into normal times. And our calibration will be such that very rarely you're going to have a financial recession where things are big, and that's where the welfare consequences are large. All these other small recessions that made people give up on business cycle research altogether because these were very small blips, we think of these as just sort of second order things that people lump into normal times. That wouldn't matter much, but yeah.
One possibility of a way that a financial recession would be different, given I think what I understand of your model is I could see if that influenced basically the young people's ability to borrow to buy houses, right?
So in fact, the very last slide I will show you is, so I will treat generations as homogeneous within, which is of course blatantly simplifying. There's going to be, in the data there's poor, there's rich young households and the like. I will break that out into some households that I will roughly associate with those that never will have much access to financial markets. I will make it such that they just, because they're impatient, they don't care. And I will document the welfare losses separately for sort of the young households that expect to be participating in financial markets, that will be benefiting from my mechanism, and then people that, in my case, because of preferences, don't feel like doing this, and the welfare consequences are going to be fundamentally different from one another. Those non-financially participating young households, their welfare losses will look very similar, still a bit smaller, but fairly similar to the elderly. It's the young households that have not lost their job in the Great Recession, that still have the ability to borrow against their future income, for which this is relevant. Okay, so it's clearly not a story for every young household. It's for the young households that believe they will make use of financial markets to either buy houses or financial assets for their retirement in the future. For those that don't, the only thing that I have to say is the labor market, and I will show you labor market for the young was awful. I'm not rewriting history there at all. It's another mechanism I want to focus on, and for a bunch of young households that will never be relevant. And for those households, I have nothing good to say. So it's the young assistant professor that came to California, has a nice job, perhaps not the wage growth as expected, comes here and then as house prices fall by 30%. This is the silver lining of the Great Recession that I'm talking. Then we can have a debate about how many people those are relative.
So it's interesting that you say that, because I mean, I think one thing that's been documented in our profession is that actually people who come out in those years of downturns where government is not hiring and things like that because of revenue problems really are harmed substantially over the course of their career.
Yes.
And is there a labor market side with dynamic effects over time that you're incorporating in this as well, or not?
In a limited sense. So there's this literature on scarring that documents that if you come out of college in a recession, it takes you a long time to recover back to what your pre-recession cohorts look like. So Lisa Kahn has a very nice paper showing that only after 10, 15 years that effect disappears. Now, it's not so clear that this is stronger for young rather than for older workers. So the classic paper in that literature is Lalonde, Jacobs, and Sullivan, closing of a steel mill in Pennsylvania, documenting how long it took those workers. And they found very substantial scarring effect, but no heterogeneity by age. So what I will have is my Great Recession will take a long time, so the income losses will not just be between 2007 and 2009. There will be very persistent income losses for 10, years, and since there's a chance of something even nastier happen, an expectation even beyond that. What is not the case is that the young are differentially affected by that scarring. Everybody is going to have these long-lasting income losses. The young do not have differentially large income losses. It's not clear that that is counterfactual. I mean, certainly the old Lalonde et al. Paper would say that's perfectly in line with the data. More recent studies have focused on the young and have documented substantial scarring effects. But my reading of the literature is that the scarring effects are very substantial also for older learners.
Could you consider variance within these groups? So if you take the house issue, young people who get good jobs can buy a house. So at these reduced prices, they come out way ahead. But young people who don't get a good job can't buy a house. So they both aren't getting this benefit and they get hurt. So on average, maybe young people are the same, but there's winners and losers.
Yeah, so the group that I mentioned, the people that I think of not being very active in financial markets, I mean, they're going to look basically like your second group. They're going to have high income losses, and they will not have participation in the financial markets. The other group, so I will document that the other group looks quite good. Maybe I'm actually understating how good they look, because I only look at that group by saying they have the average income losses on the labor market, but then they participate in financial markets, and the net consequence of that is very small welfare losses. Maybe these guys not only participate in financial markets, but their income losses were smaller than those guys that didn't participate, and then I would elevate those welfare losses to even welfare gains. For the guys that are non-participating in financial markets, they look as awful as the old, so we can debate of whether as awful means 2% more awful, that's fine. I think that group, I will show you the numbers, but it's not that much on the horizon for them anyway. So one thing we could easily do is try to correlate their income losses in the Great Recession with their wealth level. We have looked at in the initial wealth level and initial income, but not how much they dropped. My suspicion is they're correlated. So my last table should probably have deeper losses for the poor and smaller losses for the wealth richer. Yeah. So, but let me try to convince you first that there's actually some salience in the story to start with. So this is from Microdata, Survey of Consumer Finances. This is a big household level data set, happens every 3 years, samples 4,000 to 5,000 households, asks them very detailed questions, not only about income, but precisely about net worth, oversamples the very wealthy, and then you use sample rates to scale it back to the population. Why is that important here? Because wealth is very skewed, and therefore if you miss the very wealthy, you're going to miss a ton of wealth. That's why we use the Survey of Consumer Finances. Group people in 2007 into 6 age groups, those with household heads between 20 and 29, 30, 39, and so forth, and calculate, and that's the red line, average labor income for that age group, and then the blue line, net worth for that age group. So this, and labor income is plotted on this axis, and net worth is plotted on this axis. There's one more zero on the left and on the right axis, just in order to get the magnitudes straight. So what does this say? It says that the average 20 to 29-year-old household, the age is again defined by household head, earns $40,000 in 2007. That rises to a little bit more than 100,000 in terms of their earnings when they go to their peak earnings years around the mid-50s, and then falls towards retirement. The reason why also retired people have significant amounts of labor income comes from the fact that we think of Social Security taxes as reducing your labor income, and Social Security benefits as being part of your labor income. So that explains why those guys have substantial labor income as well, mainly composed of Social Security benefits. So that red line should be sufficient, I mean, fairly uncontroversial in the sense that any micro data set where you plot labor earnings over the life cycle always displays this. What I want you to take away from this picture is that if you think about the young in the Great Recession, lots of future labor income yet to come. Or another way of stating is, if you calculate their human wealth, it's very high for the young because all their future earnings years, high earnings years are still ahead of them. Now, let's turn to net worth. Again, net worth, value of all assets, net value of all liabilities. That's this axis. Basic observation is there's not much in terms of net worth for young households. Then over the life cycle, households accumulate net worth towards retirement, and then they start drawing down their wealth in retirement. And the numbers are big here. As I said, this is the left axis, and these are averages within age cohorts. So that states that the average net worth of a household around retirement age is in the order of $1 million US. It is important for the magnitudes of these pictures that these are means as opposed to medians. If I were to plot medians, exactly the same profiles, but everything shifted quite substantially downward. For income, shifted downward by a bit. For wealth, shifted even more downwards because there's this right skewness of the distribution with respect to wealth. Wealth is very highly concentrated in the US population. On the other hand, you want to write down a macro model. You just can't miss a lot of wealth at the very right hand of the distribution, so that's why we look initially at that. And depending where I give this paper, this 1 million seems sort of outrageously large, but on the other hand, if you own a decent house in a major metropolitan area and you have paid down your mortgage, the value of your house basically gets you there to a significant extent.
Does this also include the value of one's pension, or is this, what are considered assets there?
Yeah, so assets are all the assets we can possibly measure. So it includes financial assets, ownership of direct ownership of stocks, all the assets that you have in 401k pension plans. What we have a hard time, like everybody else, has a hard time measuring is company pensions. And what is missing here in the blue line is the capitalized value of Social Security. So we treat public Social Security as a negative when you pay the taxes in the red line, and a positive in terms of labor income, but it's not in net worth. So I think the main thing that's missing here is defined benefit pension plans of companies, which are small. Well, I mean, they're getting reduced more and more in value, but they're not, I mean, we know that they're not completely small potatoes. And my suspicion is that if we were to have them, that would shift even further up the distribution of wealth towards the old houses. Because the one thing that I want to highlight here is, where is the net worth? The net worth is very much in the hands of the 50 to 70-year-old households. So if you think about a massive decline in asset prices, even if that massive decline is somewhat temporary, if you think about a life cycle model where the old don't have much to live yet, at least in expectation, these massive declines in asset valuations will translate into massive falls in welfare to the extent that these old households have most of the net worth, whereas the massive decline in asset prices for the young is essentially irrelevant because they have no net worth to start. I mean, no, it's not that I'm saying they have nothing, but it's just not potatoes relative to me.
These are before tax.
The assets are before.
Because if it's a home, then any capital gains up to 500K, you don't pay taxes on, so it's actually better than that.
It is, yes,
Right?
yes.
You're not paying taxes on
Yes, I mean, if you think about, which is going to be true in my model, these are assets that eventually households will use to consume. If you don't have to pay capital gains on them, that's right. So we could try to calculate the sort of consumption equivalent value from those assets, trying to treat taxes on financial and real assets a bit more seriously. I think that would probably accentuate that picture quite a bit. Okay, so to a first approximation, this is a big part of the story. Young households, lots of future labor income, will be hurt by the labor market, have no financial wealth, have no assets mainly in the hand of the elderly, asset prices fall by 3 times as much as labor income. You put this together, you have sort of the first order sense of where the welfare gains are going. Against that is the fact that net worth is not equal to net worth. If you break out net worth into assets that are safe and assets that are risky, because only the risky assets were subject to this decline in asset values, and if you do that and plot the asset values by age, you get this picture. So let me explain what this is again. These are my 6 age groups, and now I break out net worth in a bunch of different categories: stocks, residential real estate, ownership of businesses, this is commercial real estate. So these we call risky assets. And if you calculate portfolio share, what share of your total net worth is in risky assets, where risky assets, as I said, are stocks, real estate, and ownership of businesses, you see that most of the risky assets are actually in the hand of young households. Young households have a very substantially risky portfolios. In fact, their portfolio share in risky assets is more than 100%. How can that be? It just simply says that young households own a house on the gross side. They have borrowed against that house. If you think of debt as a negative safe assets, which is the way we treat it, then you get the fact that young households are simply leveraged because they own a house and part of the house is owned by the bank. That's what these numbers are. And if you go further down in the age distribution, old households significantly reduce their share of risky assets, but they still own a very substantial share of risky assets as well, partially because they own houses too, and they have very substantial ownerships of financial assets as well.
But aren't they the likely ones to walk away from the debt?
Yeah, so if you think about this classification, there's sort of two choices we have to make, and these are important choices, so let me try to defend them. The first choice is treating houses as risky assets, which I think prior to the Great Recession, people thought housing is boring, nothing ever happens with them.
It never goes down.
You know, a national decline of house price indices by 30% is a 5% deviation event. After the Great Recession, lumping houses into risky assets, I think, is defensible, and certainly for the story of the Great Recession, I think it makes sense. The more controversial choice is we think of debt, which very much includes mortgage debt, that's the most important debt, as a negative safe asset. And this is true if you abstract from default on credit cards and foreclosure on your mortgage home, which makes that debt partially state contingent, and therefore it's not quite a safe negative assets. And it's true that foreclosures did spike up and default rates did spike up, but there was still a fairly rare event. So this is a choice that I'm a little bit more worried about. But for most households, it's I think plausible.
There were a lot of short sales also, and forgiveness of the debt.
And a lot of short sales.
So I went to Vegas.
Oh,
Yes.
it's the short sell capital of the world.
Yes.
30% underwater, easy out.
Yeah.
So the one thing that I want to highlight, because this is going to be relevant going forward, it is the case that there is quite substantial leverage among the young, because these are going to be numbers that our model we will take very seriously and hopefully will reproduce. The young have substantial leverage, but for portfolios as a whole, at least in this fairly aggregated world, these are not humongous leverage numbers. So if you tell me, well, leverage constraint tightened from 80% to 60%, that wouldn't do anything in this model. What I think about this is, think about this as a mixture of stocks and real estate. Think about a world where you cannot borrow against stocks, but you can borrow against real estate. This number basically says, with roughly 50-50 portfolios, it says you can borrow 80% against your house and nothing at all against your stocks. That's what this 140% risky asset comes down to. So if you were to tighten constraint, would that have a huge impact on the young as a whole? According to these aggregated data, not. Now, once we break up the young into these different groups, then of course there will be parts of the young which will be significantly affected in their ability to buy the house that they might want to buy. Okay. So suppose you're not into models and you want to get a first sense of how big these numbers are. One thing you can do is simple accounting. You see in 2007 what the portfolios were. We have data on a very fine set of asset prices, houses, and so forth. One thing we can easily do, take the portfolio in 2007 and revalue them at prices in 2009, 2013, 2015, and so forth. Of course, that's under the maintained assumption that households don't rebalance their portfolios, which is clearly counterfactual, but that gives you a first sense of how large the capital losses from these declines in asset prices were. So if you do this and you take an average from 2009 to 2013, that matters a bit because 2009 is the nastiest period, and from that point we had some recovery. If the marketing department wants these numbers to be big, we just pick 2009, and I have that too, but that's why we picked an average. you get sort of these hypothetical wealth losses that are first large and then very heterogeneous across the age population, to the extent that these young households, they had about $85,000 net worth, and revaluing them, they lost about $24,000 of that net worth, whereas households at the age between 60 and 69, according to this revaluation exercise, lost about $200,000, and if you take 2009 as the benchmark, close to $300,000. So these are big numbers for the average, not median, but average household across these age periods. Now, this does not translate one-to-one into welfare losses, because welfare will depend on consumption, and that will depend on the timing of consumption, which will include the recovery. But that gives you a sense of the potential magnitude and the difference.
Not its own for age, for loss. It's suddenly negative, 60 to 69.
The 60 to 69, they have the largest, and then it declines.
So you're not, red is not negative, sorry.
No, so red is just, these are the numbers I want to highlight. The difference between the
Doesn't count.
no. These are all very positive wealth losses. Now again, these are just book losses. I'm not saying that these are realized capital losses. People might have held on to their assets. If most of the assets are in your real estate, people might have just stayed put. So these are just hypothetical accounting losses from this big movement in asset prices, trying to document that these asset price movements were very large, and the potential to affect households of different ages heterogeneously is very large.
So I presume there's also the people who don't own homes that are renting. If the rents go down, is that somehow captured in the income that you're?
Not in the income, but it will be captured in the consumption profile, because the price, the consumption value of the real estate will be lower, and you're going to pay lower. Actually, that's a good point in a partial comeback. Even if you don't participate in the housing market because you might be credit constrained or the like, in a world where house prices and rent prices are perfectly correlated, the young renters might benefit even though they do not participate in the housing stock because they face cheaper rent. Now, it is the case that rents are less volatile than house prices, so that story is theoretically pleasant, but quantitatively probably not important, but it's nevertheless there.
Isn't the actual story different, that you had all these houses that got foreclosed on that then were vacant, and then rentals went up because you had people that left those houses and
No,
flooding the rental market?
So what went up is the rent to house price ratio. So if you think about a dividend ratio, what went up is that house prices fell more than rents. So rents, it's all relative to trend. Rents fell as well. House prices fell, but house prices fell much more. So relative to owning, renting became more expensive, but in absolute terms, it became less expensive as well.
Except for those who just sat in the house, didn't they?
Yes. So now that actually, I mean, so at some point I'm going to write down a model, and the model is going to be having assets, and I think that housing is an important part of my assets. One reservation against that model will be that my housing assets will look like a financial asset. So you might ask the question, how about real owner-occupied housing? Right? So my story goes perfectly through if there's a perfectly liquid rental market and people buy houses, and they can either rent them out or they can rent them to themselves. In that world, my story is perfectly fine. In a world where there's frictions to adjustment and real owner-occupied housing,
I don't think there was larger demand for rentals either, even though there were people leaving their owner-occupied houses or whatever. It's also true that there was not as many households being formed because of the bad side of the labor market, and so demand went down.
yeah, so that's
that
something.
certainly happened here in this area.
I mean, that's something that I would have. I mean, so there's a very nice paper by Greg Chapman in JP documenting that cohabitation is very strongly counter-cyclical. So one have to deal with the Great Recession is just move back to your parents' bedroom, and that seemed to have happened a lot.
Yeah.
Now, if I were to try to document the welfare consequences from that, I would have to make certain judgments that might be hard. But that's certainly not true.
So if you treat housing as a financial asset, presumes that you consume all the financial assets as you get older. So by the end of your lifetime, you consume everything. Presumably in practice, you do not consume your housing and financial assets, you bequest them. And so aren't you giving maybe the worst shot at the older guys because the bequest is for the younger guys? So who's really getting hit is the younger guys, not the older guys. Most of the wealth is.
Yeah, so I haven't told you what type of life cycle model I'm going to write down, but let me anticipate and tell me it's going to be a pure life cycle model which will abstract from bequests. So you might say, isn't that misleading for the elderly? Because one adjustment is, you know, they don't have to consume as well. They can just load it into low bequests. Now, if you model bequest as, at least in macro most people do, as a warm glow bequest model, you get utility from giving bequest. That would be fully isomorphic to my model for the elderly. So I think for the elderly, if you allow me to write down a standard model of bequest motivated by warm glow, this would be all fine.
But you do with consumption differentials, right? The welfare calculation.
Right, but that's as long
You
as
put that in.
as long as the curvature on the bequest function is the same as the curvature on the utility function, that would completely go through now. It's not quite as benign because it's not only who gives the bequest, but the thing is also who receives the bequest. So if I want to make a statement about the young, one thing I have to worry about is Great Recession happens, asset values fall, the old guys give less bequests. That's painful for them because they have it in their utility function. I'm fine the way I model it. But how about the young receiving less bequests and therefore having welfare losses from that? Now, if you look at the data, who receives bequests? It's not the young. Luckily for us, our parents die when we are 50 or 60 rather than 20. So I think it might affect the middle age calculations quite a bit because these bequests are missing as wealth transfers for the middle age. But I don't think it has a strong impact on the young. If I really want to take a shot on myself, but what I'm most worried about is not bequest, but inter-vivos transfer. So this idea that stock market's not doing well, financial wealth losses are significant for the older generations. What does that do to your parents and especially your grandparents' ability to help you pay college in terms of inter-vivos transfers? So that's something, in terms of the magnitude of the effect, that's the main thing that one would be worried about. Which is heterogeneous, doesn't affect everyone, but we know that from the data, inter-vivos transfers might be as important as bequests. So that's, I think, when this entire bequest topic, the most worrisome part for my big story about the young is, I think, the reduction, the potential reduction in transfers for the 20 to 30-year-olds from transfers from the elderly, triggered by the fact that they are less wealthy because of the Great Recession. So that would not be.
So you talked about two kind of groups in the young. There's those that want to buy the assets post-recession and those that can't because they're priced out. But there's a third group that seems especially badly affected, which are those that buy these risky housing assets shortly before, and then they're more underwater than the elderly, and now they also can't move for labor market reasons, right?
Yeah. So abstracting from the last one, the rest is there, right? Because I looked at portfolios, even of the young, and the young have very risky assets. So when they hit the Great Recession, as a share of their net worth, they actually are strongly affected. They don't have a lot of net worth, but whatever net worth they have is declining a lot because it's so risky. So that is there. The good part for them is, if they have that risky stuff on their portfolio, as long as they don't have to sell it, if an expectation things recover, they can just walk it off. The problem would be that if among those young, there's significantly more unemployment risk, and I will show you that in terms of incomes in a bit. If these guys are forced to sell because they can't make payments, that wouldn't be there. The fact that they lose a larger share of their net worth, that's by construction in these numbers. The fact that in my model they would not sell. In the data, a small fraction of them, because of labor market experience, were forced to sell, and for them that would be a double whammy. So if you have these sort of poor young, for which I not have much good to say, I agree that there's a subgroup that probably gets an extra whammy from that. That group is probably fairly small, but it would be there.
Yeah, a lot of those were interest-only loans and bank house.
Yeah, they were 95% and 100% loans, July loans.
No, sure. I mean, in a world where this was 100% credit finance and they walked away from it, when you can take the cynical view, these guys got to live in a nice place for a while and then they just walked away from the debt. What's their problem? Now, this would not be consistent with my good group story, but I don't want to push it too hard because I think there were certainly people like that. I don't think that group was overly much. So far, I've told you mainly bad things for the elderly in terms of their portfolio exposition and the young houses with lots of labor income looking not so bad. Now the story is not as rosy because if you document the losses relative to trend from the labor market broken down by age, on average, this is my 10% that I documented in the blue line, close to 10%, but this is not symmetric across the age distribution. Young households lose significantly more, and for the 70 plus, remember most of the income actually comes from Social Security, so the fact that these losses, they're just losses relative to trend. I mean, Social Security payments did not increase not as fast as they used to, but the income losses from Social Security were basically nil. Most of the income losses are among the young households. Now, in my model, it does not matter whether these income losses come from lower wages or higher incidence of unemployment. In the data, a big part of these higher income losses come from the fact that the increase on unemployment was especially severe among the young relative to the elderly. As long as I don't disaggregate, it doesn't matter for me, but once I start to disaggregate, of course, it does matter that a big part of this decline comes from some people actually massively losing income because of increased unemployment. So, well, that was a lengthy introduction. The good thing is that
It's us, it's not you.
the rest
We'll
of
let you go.
the rest of the paper is really simple. So let me summarize what I wanted to say. If you look at labor income and wealth, very strongly depending on age. The young, lots of future labor income. The old, lots of financial wealth. Assets fell 3 times as much as labor income. That speaks for the elderly being at the short end of the Great Recession. On the other hand, portfolios say the old have less risky portfolios, so that mitigates that statement somewhat. And then if you look at the labor market is nasty for just about everyone, but especially nasty for the young. That again mitigates the first point to some degree. The question is, once you write down a model that has the ability to capture these and only these 3 elements, and you put a welfare criterion on households, how nasty was the Great Recession for households of different generations. So what I will write down is, depending on what type of models you like, a very simplistic heterogeneous agent model that is able to capture this heterogeneity perfectly in 2007. And by perfectly, I don't mean perfectly in an elegant way, but perfectly in a calibration sense that I will have enough degree of freedom of making the model in 2007 look precisely like the data, because I have enough degrees of freedom. Then I will generate a Great Recession and will use the model main utility function to document the welfare loss. So this is sort of the rest of the plan. I will set out in one slide an overlapping generations model with aggregate risk. Really, it only takes one slide. It will take one slide to put some numbers on it. There's a lot of details there that I will skip to some degree, and I will highlight the core ingredients. I will enable it to the 2007 microdata. So all the pictures that I showed you from the microdata will be true in my model, my construction. I will then engineer a Great Recession that will look like the blue and red aggregate line, where incomes will drop by 10%, asset prices will drop on impact by 30%. That will require some work. That does not come for free in an asset pricing model like the one I'm going to write down. And then I will ask 3 questions. Can it generate the asset price declines as in the data? Yes. Can it generate portfolios by age that look like in the data? Almost. And then I will use that model to just answer the welfare question, and hopefully we'll try to explain where they come. So this is the model in one slide. So to the extent that you've taken some graduate macro, think about your favorite Samuelson 1965 overlapping generations model. That model had 2 generations and no aggregate risk. This is going to be an overlapping generation model where people lived for 6 periods, exactly these 6 age groups that I showed you in the data. And there will be aggregate risk driven by some productivity shock. And that aggregate risk will do 3 things. It will shift labor incomes, and it will move around asset prices. That's what this aggregate shock does. So specifically, that aggregate shock Z can take 3 values. Zn, that's normal times. So this is the economy being on trend. Zr, that's my Great Recession state. With some probability, when we're on trend, we drop into a Great Recession. And if you're in a Great Recession, there's a small probability that something really nasty happens and we slip from a Great Recession into a Great Depression. You might say, oh, well, why do I need that for? Because my story of the Great Recession is that there was no Great Depression, but the fact that it became possible is very important for disciplining asset prices. In particular, one puzzling thing in the data was that if you look at asset prices in the Great Recession, stock prices fell, dropped like a stone. House prices fell more slowly, but remained low. But one asset price did not drop, where you would think that in a world where you have a big drop in output and then a potential recovery, you would think of a big drop in bond prices, a big increase in interest rates. If you look at the data, interest rates stayed flat or even declined. How do you make that happen? Very, very hard in the model. How do we make that happen? Great Recession hits. All of a sudden people freak out and say, well, Great Depression might be coming. Lots of precautionary savings demand for safe assets. Everybody wants to go and bond. Bond prices have to adjust. Bond prices stabilize. Interest rates are low. This is sort of this flight to safety that we saw in the data coming through in the model, triggered by the fact that Great Recession happens. The fear of the Great Depression lingers. As a side remark, doesn't matter for me whether that fear is just in people's head or whether it's a real possibility in the economy. The asset pricing implications would be identical. The welfare implications not quite, because the fact that the Great Depression comes with the possibility, the Great Recession comes with the possibility of a Great Depression, makes the welfare consequences from the Great Recession more problematic, because now all of a sudden you have to count for this chance of really...
What about the third party that's buying debt all over the place, which would be the Fed?
Very good. In my conclusion, I will have to say, so
Okay.
in the model it won't be there,
Okay, just...
but there would be a very good role for the Fed doing exactly what it's doing. The way I've set up the model, aggregate output is driven by an exogenous shock Z, nothing the Fed can do about it. So the Fed's stepping in and buying assets, completely irrelevant for the real economy, but if you believe my numbers, the young looking much better than the old, now the Fed steps in, what does it do? Stabilize the drop in asset prices. That's exactly what you want to do from a welfare perspective if you want to even out the welfare losses according to my calculations. So my story for Fed intervention would be, didn't do anything for the real economy. After all, this is Minnesota real business cycles. But from a distributional aspect, it's a well-conceived policies because it mitigates the welfare losses for the elderly from the drop in asset prices. And for the young, this is exactly what the young didn't want because they want low asset prices, so they didn't like that intervention. The other story you could tell, how about government debt? How about the government's willingness to reshuffle part of the welfare losses and shifting them to future generations? Again, if you believe my welfare numbers, that's perfectly legitimate because it shifts welfare losses from the elderly to the current young and future generations that have to repay it.
I like that.
You see the issues created by the scheme of Krueger's model and the international shock. The financial markets was just everything.
Yeah, so in fact, I was initially very worried about that, but to the extent that the Great Recession was a worldwide phenomenon, if it was a US phenomenon, you would think there would be potential intergenerational redistribution, but also international redistribution. But I think the scope for that in the Great Recession was very limited because it was a worldwide shock.
We dumped a lot of the bad assets on it.
It could have been way worse. The good German savings bank helped you guys a lot in that regard. So in a way, I mean, the model is really simple. So output is being produced using this technology shock, Z, that can take three values. And then there's capital and labor. And there's two assumptions now. One is, I think, very innocuous. The other one is certainly not. First assumption is that labor is exogenous. So labor will change, and that change will be age-dependent to capture these age-dependent income losses. But as long as it's exogenous, I can normalize to whatever I want it to normalize. That's just the scaling. And I normalize it to 1 for simplicity. And now we make a substantive assumption that says capital is also in fixed supply. Think of that as land. And then output is just equal to Z because labor is normalized to 1. The supply of capital is normalized to 1. And then what is capital? Capital is the claim to a fraction theta of output being paid to bondholders in dividends. Now, why is that a substantive assumption? Because if capital could adjust, part of the shock would not go into asset prices, but asset quantities. investment and the like, and that's what I'm shutting down. And whoever has done asset pricing in their life, they know that asset pricing in production economies is harder, not conceptually, but in order to get good numbers, than asset pricing in endowment economies, the ones that I've written down here. So that's where this assumption is by. Fixed quantity means that other things equal, I have an easier time having asset prices too. If I had production, I would have to have higher risk aversion to make the same volatility in asset prices. So that is clearly not an innocuous assumption, but one that we make and that allows us to get away with a risk aversion coefficient that's relatively benign relative to something that's larger. So output is then equal to Z, and a Great Recession is just a drop from Z normal to Z recession. A drop of 10% in total incomes in the economy, a fraction theta of that income goes to capital owners, a fraction 1 minus theta of income goes to workers as labor income, and then there's an age dependent component of labor income. So epsilon I of Z, that's the labor productivity of generation I at time Z. So these are 6 numbers that I will make up to exactly reproduce that hump-shaped labor income profile that I showed you in the data. And the dependence on Z, I will use to make it such that the income losses from the Great Recession are uneven across the generation. So these numbers, these individual labor productivities, are 12 numbers, exactly enough to generate hump-shaped labor income profile in 2007, and the drop in that labor income profile that we observed in the data, coming completely mechanically through.
Is that unique? Is that labor profile unique in the sense that only that combination would be a...
Yeah, so I mean, this is a very simple labor market structure with competitive markets where wages directly map into productivity, and for a given labor income profile, there's a unique epsilon profile that does it.
Wait, where are the 12?
6 for the normal times, where I showed you that red line, and then I showed you that the drop in labor income was age dependent. In order to capture that, we make it such that in the recession, for the young households, this drops further than for the older household, to capture the fact that the young household lost 15% of labor income and the old households only 1.7%. So 6 numbers in normal times, 6 numbers in the recession period, exactly capturing these 12 numbers from the data.
You don't recover it in third period.
We have to take a stand on that, and we say that it's like in the recession period. The labor profile is in the recession period because we have to take a stand on it because it's a full rational expectations model. Now that state is extremely unlikely, and for our calculations it doesn't materialize, but like in any rational expectations equilibrium, it will have an impact on equilibrium prices as well. We could have gone the extra mile and maybe looked at the Great Depression and perhaps took a look at what profiles did there, but micro data in 1930s are somewhat, I think it's not impossible, because around that period, the US economists got all freaked out and started to collect the data like no tomorrow, so there are some data from that period, so it would be possible. Here we take it to be like in the recession period. So on the production side, this is really just a standard neoclassical production function where output is divided into labor and capital. That capital income is again split between 2 sources. There's a fixed number of outstanding bonds B. So part of that capital income is a payment to bondholders. And the remaining part of capital income then goes as payment to stockholders, to these owners of that fixed K normalized to 1. There are shares being traded. And what are the shareholders getting of that fixed capital? They get the dividends, whatever payments to capital are left over once you pay the bond. So there's 2 key endogenous prices: the price of the 1-period bond, which is in fixed supply equal to B, and the price of the stock, and there's 1 unit share of stocks, and both prices are endogenously determined in equilibrium. Now, what do these prices depend upon? This is the bond price, this is the stock price. Of course, they depend on the aggregate state of the economy. And crucially, and that's sort of the problem with these type of models, it depends on A, which is the cross-sectional distribution of assets across these 6 different age groups. Because the equilibrium price will depend who owns what asset. And in overlapping generations model, that's fairly intuitive. If you're an old person, your marginal propensity to consume out of wealth is going to be much higher than that for young. So the age distribution will matter for the determination of asset prices. So computing an equilibrium despite the fact that this model is almost trivial to write down, is not that trivial because these pricing functions are mapping from the Z, which can take 3 values, and then a 6-dimensional continuous state space into prices of assets and capital, coming from the fact that they depend on the distribution. So this A, that's a list of 6 numbers capturing the wealth of these six generations. So what is the heterogeneity in the model? Purely H, there are 6 H groups, and they differ according to their labor productivity and therefore their labor income. They also will differ according to their impatience, so we allow households to be differentially patient by age. Now, where do we need that for? We need to generate an equilibrium. We need from a hump-shaped income profile, an asset profile where people accumulate substantial assets over their life cycle. How do we make that happen? We make that happen such that households are appropriately patient over their life cycle, such that given their income profile and given the stochastic nature of the problem, they precisely in 2007 accumulate the asset portfolio that looks like the blue line. Okay? So again, when I said Minnesota style, I meant this in 2 senses. The first is aggregate fluctuations are driven by these technology shocks, although I really don't care what the shocks are as long as they move incomes. The other one is when I said I nailed the model to 2007, the model has enough degrees of freedom on the micro side to precisely make that happen. And you will need the betas because if you look at this labor income profile, what are people early in life going to do if they face this labor income profile? Well, they would like to borrow. Why are they saving? Well, because they're sufficiently patient, because we think of these betas standing in for changes in family size, and maybe you want to save a lot when you're in your 30s because you expect your household size to grow. That's what stands in for the betas. But mechanically, given the labor income profile, the betas are chosen such that in the normal state, households optimally choose the asset profile that they chose in the data.
There are many combinations that would achieve that.
No.
Right? No,
No.
there's only one.
So calibration is actually, we think it's somewhat clever, although nobody cares. Well, what you can do from the data, once you have incomes and you have wealth,
Yeah.
you can back out consumption.
Yeah.
Once you have consumption, you can write down the Euler equation, you have consumption growth. Once you have consumption growth, that is, so the Euler equation says beta times consumption growth raised to the sigma. Once you have consumption growth from the data, because I have all the ingredients to calculate consumption growth, that has to be equal to the return on assets. We will calibrate that to be in the data. Then you can pick the betas directly that make consumption growth consistent with those equilibrium conditions. So there's a unique mapping because once I make sure the model is consistent with wealth and income, it's consistent with consumption by the budget constraint. Then from the Euler equation and saying that the return is 4%, say, I know exactly what beta I need, such that the consumption growth gives me that.
I mean, the last beta you fix it at 0, right? For the
Yeah. So for those guys, it's equal to 0. These are only 5 numbers
okay.
because the betas only matter for consumption versus saving from one period to the next.
How's the sequence declining, increasing? How
It's in a way. I mean, I should plot it, but you can see it from the wealth numbers. High and increasing around here because there's a lot of wealth accumulation, and then falling from here to here, and then it trivially drops to 0 because there's no incentives to
The no request, like that's.
but no big requests. So the idea is that for the elderly, whether you eat your wealth or you decrease it, as long as the felicity function for bequest has the same structure as your utility function, that wouldn't matter. Now, is that a good assumption? There's a lot of good work by Maria Cristina Dinardi working on bequest, suggesting that bequests are actually a luxury good, suggesting that my CRA utility function is probably not the best function for bequests, because you want to generate an observation that most people don't get bequests. So my implicit assumption that these are the same functions is probably not a great one. For wealthy people it's fine, but for poor people probably not. Okay. So let's see. So I think I've described the model in its entirety. So it's a 4 rational expectations model. In every period there's 6 generations living with one another, trading bonds and stocks with one another, into key endogenoous prices, which are a function of the entire state space, are the price of bonds and the price of stocks, clearing both the bond market and the stock market.
Did the size of each generation enter into the model?
It's the same across generations, which is not too much at odds. For these 10-year intervals, it's not too much at odds with the survey of consumer finance. If you look at the relative composition, it's not too bad of an approximation. There's sort of, when we go to calibration, we have to adjust it slightly because it's not quite true, but roughly it's.
So you can inject immigration.
We could. I mean, so as long as demographics is exogenous, we could assume whatever. In fact, if there is population aging, depending on what the criterion is, this would help us in the following sense. If there's population aging, it's much easier to put pressure on stock prices in that model because there's a larger group of old people wanting to sell. So that would actually help us with the asset pricing, but it's not there. As long as immigration or fertility or demographics is exogenous, in these type of models, it's always easy to do. And I've quite a few papers trying to exploit that. If you try to endogenize it, then that's a mess. Then that's a mess. That's not sure. Okay, so that's basically what the model is. All G model, aggregate shocks, 6 generations, trading bonds and stocks. Numbers. To some degree, I've already talked about these numbers. So on the micro side, there are these differential time discount rates and the productivity parameters. We choose them so that 2007 looks exactly like the data is already described. I think that is one core ingredient into the model. There's a bunch of other choices we have to make, but let me highlight the key, perhaps non-standard choices that are here as well. We have to come up with this process that drives aggregate incomes and aggregate stock prices and everything. Three states, which means if you think about the Markov transition matrix, a Markov matrix that has nine entries. So the way we choose the states is simply to say normal times are normalized to 1, that's innocuous normalization. Great Recession, it's exactly that drop of income by 10% that we observed in the data, so that's data. And then we have to come up with the notion of how bad is a Great Depression, which again is just this fear state that is there in order for asset pricing, but will never be materialized. But how bad the bad state is going to be crucial for bond prices. So this is 30%, which is our best measure of how much output fell between 1929 and 1933 relative to the trend. So this is based on the observation that there was one Great Depression that we had in the data, that was the Great Depression from 1929 to 1933, and that's our measure of how much output fell relative to trend. Now the Markov transition matrix, so what is this? This is a matrix that tells me if I'm in the normal state, this is a probability of staying there. So if I'm in 2007, I think most likely I'm going to stay there. But there is a non-trivial chance of seeing the Great Recession. So in my model, the Great Recession is unlikely, but people are not completely oblivious to the fact that it can happen. And there might be some disagreement in the room that that's a good description of expectations in 2007, but that's what this is. And there's no chance directly going to a Great Depression. The only way to go to a Great Depression is through the Great Recession. In the Great Recession, you either recover, and that's most likely going to happen, but that is this fear state. The bottom might fall out of the economy, and then things get nasty and you go to this state. If you go to the Great Depression, you will recover in one period, which however is 10 years here. So these are all long events. Now, the zeros that you see here, they are made up, in a sense that there's no data equivalent that we know of how to pin it down, so we restrict them to 0. Those numbers, they are calibrated to us asking how, in the time series, how many Great Depressions we think we saw in the data. There was only one, the Great Depression. How many Great Recessions did we see in the data? We define that as unemployment reaching a particular threshold. We define it in terms of deviations from income trends, and that gives us a measure such that the Great Recession actually in the data counts as a Great Recession in our model. So that was our requirement. And so that gives us a probability of a Great Recession for the last 100 years of 13%. So Great Recessions are not completely uncommon event. The Great Depression is a unique event. The Great recession. There was one in which we call the Great Recession, and then there were nasty events just prior to World War I, one in 1894. So if you count all these events, you get this. You get this number. So this is, broadly speaking, data, although certainly there's some discretionary choices to be made. The zeros, as I said, are our restriction. But one thing that I should highlight for those of you doing theory, if you look at this Markov transition matrix, from any given state today, there's only 2 possible states tomorrow that you can reach. And there's 2 assets here, so markets are sequentially complete, meaning everything that you know about complete markets in a world, however, with overlapping generations where you cannot trade with the unborn, apply here, including the computational tricks that you can use by solving effectively the social planner problem, because everybody that's alive, since markets are complete, will share risk perfectly. So the key imperfect risk sharing is between those that are alive and those that had not been born prior to the Great Recession. So when I will show you pictures, it's mainly about the newborn young versus everybody else in terms of risk sharing, because with those guys you cannot share this. The last number I want to highlight, because that is somewhat crucial, is we want a model such that for a given drop in incomes, and also therefore asset incomes, we generate a drop in asset prices that's roughly 3 times as large, or we precisely measure it to be in the data to be 2.7 times as large. And if you want to generate that in this model, you might say, well, yeah, there's all the G stuff. Surely you can make asset prices move more than incomes. Not so easy at all. You need sufficiently high risk aversion, or equivalently sufficiently low intertemporal elasticity of substitution. In fact, one, I think, nice proposition we have in the paper, which nobody cares about, is if you take log utility, and if you assume that these income drops are not dependent on the aggregate state, there's a theorem that says that incomes and asset prices drop 1 for 1, and the distributional consequences are the same across all generations. So log utility, and you take away that the fluctuations of labor productivity over the cycle, you have a theorem that says log utility will not at all deliver to us the desired outcome of asset prices moving more than labor incomes. It will also deliver portfolio shares that are independent of age as well, and you can prove that. Log utility means everybody takes the same share of the aggregate risk. Asset prices move as much as incomes. Welfare consequences are equalized across the population. So that's a non-starter. So in that sense, our results are clearly absolutely not robust. You need something to the right of log, and if you make it sufficiently to the right of log, a risk aversion of a little bit more than 4, you get asset prices to move the 2.7 times. And sort of my intuition for that is, think about the intertemporal elasticity of substitution. Think about what's going on in this model. There's a drop in aggregate incomes. Somebody has to consume that drop in aggregate incomes. Now think about the asset market. Who's on the buying side? Who's on the selling side? On the buying side, you have the young households. On the selling side, you have these old households. Think about the 60-year-olds. They have a choice. They know they're going to live for 2 periods. The income dropped. Asset prices dropped a lot. They can do 2 things. They can either hold on to the assets or buy even more assets because they're cheap. But that would mean a lot of consumption losses. Or they can sell the asset at bad prices to try to stabilize their consumption. What will determine what they're going to do? They desire to smooth consumption over time, and that's exactly what 1 over sigma tells you. So intertemporal elasticity of consumption being low means these 65-year-olds have a strong incentive to smooth consumption over time. That's exactly what the young guys are waiting for. Desperate old guys selling off their assets to smooth consumption, as predicated by 1 over sigma being small. Young households facing asset values that drop much more than income. So again, this is something that not every model will deliver. In fact, you will need more than log utility to even qualitatively go in that direction, and we prove that everything that's log or less than log, you will get the opposite. Asset prices are going to move less than labor incomes. Okay. All right, 10 minutes for results. I think that no, in a way, I only want to show you 4 slides, and I think the intuition at this one hopefully is reasonably clear. The last ingredient into the calibration is the picture I already showed you, the graph I already showed you, heterogeneous losses and labor incomes in the Great Recession hitting mostly the young. So let me show you 3 main slides in terms of results. So let me entertain the thought experiment as follows. The economy is good for a long time, 2007, then the Great Recession comes along. What happens to asset prices? What happens to household portfolios? What happens to household wealth? Asset prices. So let's focus on the top line. This one is just the associated asset returns. So this has 3 lines. The blue line, that's what happens to the stock market. There's a drop in close to 30%, exactly like we observed in the data, and then some recovery, in fact, some overshooting that I'll chat about in a second. The red line looks like the most boring line in the paper, and it makes the most exciting one. That's bond prices. Bond prices remain basically flat, despite the fact that, again, what happened here? We had a big drop in Z, we had a Great Recession. Given my Markov chain, what do people expect to happen next? Most likely a recovery. So what they predict, most likely consumption growth. If you have a lot of consumption growth and expectations, what is a consistent rate of return associated with that? A higher rate of return to make people tolerate that big consumption. Bond returns are flat, bond prices are flat. Where does it come from? Again, it comes from this fear state. In one hand, you expect consumption growth, so you want to have high rates of return and low bond, high rates of return and low bond prices. On the other hand, now we are in a state in the Great Recession where the Great Depression is a possibility. Everybody wants to buy bonds for the possibility of falling into a Great Depression. That puts a lot of pressure and builds up the bond price. And the end effect is something that's roughly constant. That's good, because you say, why bother? I mean, the direct answer is because referees made us bother. But if you look at the data, the model without that third state was grossly counterfactual. You had a big collapse in bond prices as well, a big spike in the risk-free rate. You look at the Great Recession, there was nothing like that at all. In fact, it was sort of a big puzzle. Why are rates of returns on bonds so low? Flight to safety, that's what the model can deliver. Why is that important for us? Think about the young leveraged households, whether they can borrow to buy the risky asset at low risk-free rates or high risk rates matters a lot to them. So the fact that this is in fact flat is quantitatively important for our results. Portfolios. With locked utility, they would be flat. So what I have here is, in the data, these are the portfolios. Young households have riskier portfolios than old households. Red line, that's prior to the Great Recession. The model reproduces that qualitatively. In fact, it overshoots it to some degree. So in the model, young households, relative to the data, hold somewhat too risky portfolios, and old households, relative to the data, hold somewhat too safe portfolios. But why is it in the model that the young households hold riskier portfolios? Think about sort of efficient risk sharing, right? There's labor income, there's capital income. Capital income falls much more than labor income. Who has the highest endowment to labor income to tolerate that drop in capital income? Young households, because they have lots of future labor income. So it's from a risk-sharing perspective, it's efficient to have the young households hold a larger share of the risky stock because they have a larger future endowment of labor income. The economy falls into a recession. One nice feature of that is, in the model, young households deliver. The riskiness of household portfolios among the young falls in the Great Recession, very much like in the data. And you might say, well, in the data, the banks basically stopped lending to young households. And that might be partially true. What's the story in the model? There's none of that. Young households voluntarily and optimally shift their portfolios towards safer positions. Why? Because they don't want to go into the Great Depression with risky portfolios and a big drop in their labor income. And that's why they make their portfolios riskier. They're still fairly leveraged, but less leveraged than in normal times because they fear the Great Recession. Okay. These are the welfare numbers, so let me briefly just describe what the thought experiment is. Again, you wake up in 2007 and they give all households of all generations the following thought experiment. 2 scenarios. Tomorrow, normal times, and from that point on, whatever the Markov process says, or tomorrow, Great Recession, from that point on, whatever the Markov process says. How much in terms of your lifetime consumption are you willing to give up to avoid the Great Recession? Old households lose a lot from the Great Recession. They're willing to give up 10% of their pre-recession consumption to avoid it. This 10% is completely mechanical consequence of a drop in labor income, that's essentially nil for the old, and a drop in asset valuations, that's 30%. Take the convex combination, that gets you 10%. So this is completely mechanical, coming from the fact that they have a little bit of labor income, which basically doesn't drop. They have a ton of wealth that drops by close to 30%. The consequence for their lifetime consumption, which is just the last period consumption that they have, is precisely 10%. In fact, you can, that's something you could. The number I want to highlight is this 1% welfare loss for the young. So what I have here, I have a world where the young, in the current period in the Great Recession, lose 14% of their labor income. And they live in a world where tomorrow, maybe there's a recovery, but there's a good chance of a Great Depression where it's even more nasty. Yet, in terms of lifetime consumption, their losses in terms of lifetime consumption amount to a mere 1% of lifetime consumption. The question is, how come these massive labor income losses do not translate into massive welfare losses? The answer is the asset pricing channel, the endogenous movement of asset prices that go down, and then an expectation at some point during these households' lifetime will recover. How do I know? Because in the model, I'm the master, I can do all kinds of experiments. In particular, I can hold asset prices constant and see whether this story is in fact right. So let me just talk through those two numbers. So this is trying to get a sense of how important this asset pricing channel is. This was the welfare losses in my economy. This is the welfare losses that you would get if the only thing the Great Recession would do is a drop in labor income of the way I've calculated. The ranking in the welfare losses would be completely reversed. Not surprisingly, I've shown you who suffered most from the labor market. Very massive welfare losses for the young. This is in a world where the only thing that happens to the young would be a drop in labor income. Asset prices would not move. This is in a world where what happens is loss in labor incomes and also loss in asset valuations coming into the Great Recession. Doesn't matter for the young because they start with zero. So the upshot of this is that abstracting from the asset price recovery or the possibility of the asset price recovery would make the young look as bad as everybody else in this economy. The fact that in my economy, asset prices and expectation will recover lead to welfare losses that are not nearly as large as they were and makes the young in a way special relative to everybody else. In fact, let me push it one step harder. Suppose I would eliminate these heterogeneous income losses for the young and would give everybody 10% income losses, would ignore the fact that the labor market was more nasty for the young. In fact, I would generate welfare gains from the Great Recession for the young, despite the fact that they lose 10% of their income, again coming completely from this asset pricing channel. And we sort of started with that punchline. Of course, this is pretty strongly counterfactual, A, because the income losses are heterogeneous across age, so this is the right number. And then there's heterogeneity, of course, within the young, and that's going to be the last thing I'm going to show you.
But shouldn't they care about utility rather than consumption or wealth?
No, so the calculation is you take their lifetime utility, and then you have lifetime utilities, but this is an ordinal utils. So the lifetime consumption is just simply translating these utils into a cardinal measure. With homothetic utility, you can translate utils back into something tangible, such as lifetime consumption.
And can we compare cardinal measures?
Well, I mean, conditional on homothetic utility, yes. Actually, if you're worried about that, so one thing we did that I think is perhaps even less ambiguous is we could also calculate how much extra wealth, and that's in dollars, how much extra wealth do I have to give every generation to make them as well off between the two states? You get exactly the same number, which is everything is encoded in the value function, and one is just translated into wealth and one in consumption equivalent. Now, that statement is clearly only true for homothetic utility function, right? So I'm not saying that this does not require assumption, but for homothetic utility, it is.
When you say lifetime consumption is in the continuation gain, so to speak, or lifetime in the sense of first generation?
So precisely what I'm saying is that you take the stochastic consumption stream in all future period, by what percentage do you have to scale that entire process to make them as well off in the recession as in the group.
Unconditional on the age.
Well, I mean, conditional on, so for a given age, in all future periods, but of course conditional on age, because for some generations there's only 2 or 3 periods to live. In some generations there's the entire
So,
60.
8% for someone who's 50 in 2007 is 8% of the 3 periods.
Of the 3 periods, yes,
I
yes,
see.
yes.
So it's a big number.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. Now I should come clean because we talked about it. I don't want to cheat. This is what you get in the benchmark. Now let's break it off into these 2 groups. One group is basically by wealthy benchmark people, and these are low wealth households that we calibrate such that 90% of wealth is gone from these people. So these are people that only own 10% of wealth. So these are very wealth poor people. Then the welfare consequences for these people are much closer to the rest of the economy. And it's a simple insight that what's my mechanism? Asset price drop, asset price recovery. If you don't participate in that mechanism because you don't buy the stuff, then what's left is the labor market. And I showed you here, only with the labor market, it looks nasty. You know, these low wealth households are not exactly just in the labor market. They do a little bit of asset, but it's basically that story. So overall, I would say the story is, did the young gain from the Great Recession? Almost certainly not. For whom was the Great Recession, when you're young, a not bad event? Those households not as severely affected in the labor market, even though 10% of labor income drop is quite a bit. But the key aspect is those households that can expect to at some point in their life save by buying a house or saving for retirement and benefiting from the temporarily low asset prices. For these guys, there was a silver lining from the Great Recession that normal narratives might have not fully taken into account. The policy implications I already talked about, so from my perspective, that's it.
So to go back to the 2007 baseline, then, it seems like symmetric to the point you made about suppose their income wasn't shocked, suppose it was reverting to a lower mean, right? That the 2007 mean is not so high. That you get a lot out of that mean reversion to the peak of the bubble, right?
Yes. So yeah. One thing one could do, and so since we have done the numbers, I know what the outcome is. Suppose that instead of this being a mean reverting process in terms of levels, think of this as stochastic growth rates. So the 2007 shock was a permanent shock. You know, we will recover an expectation to our 2% growth, but not back to the old trend line. So it's a permanent shock. In that case, impossible to make the argument that anything like that can even remotely happen. Because then for the young guys, this is a permanent shock as well. Asset prices will not recover in expectations. What we show in the paper then is that the welfare losses are still ranked the way we have them, but they're shifted downward significantly because now it's a permanent shock for everyone. And everybody is much more severely affected, the young less so, but much more severely so affected. So then this is not on the horizon. But we do quite a fair amount of empirical work to argue that for long periods, and especially if you have in mind not only asset prices on financial assets, but housing, that mean reversion in the long run looks like a better approximation to at least the long run data than a model which has permanent traits. Although there's a huge debate about that, of course, in the applied econometrics literature. Is GDP per capita better described by mean reversion in terms of levels or stochastic growth rates? Our reading of the data is that for long periods, like 10-year intervals that we look at, mean reversion and levels looks to us the better approximation.
Other questions?
I'm speaking from Krueger, Dirk.
Yeah, you are
You're going to.
Because I have a question, like, so somebody has a benefit defined pension, and then if you're old, you get the value of that pension, but you still receive that same benefit. Now, that needs to be paid for either by the young people, either in terms of paying more into their pension, so reducing their consumption, or by reducing your future benefits. So I'm wondering, I'm not a pension researcher, so I don't know what fraction of benefit defines, but it seems like that would reach
14 to 20%.
No, but so I mean, if you take sort of the state pension funds of teachers in various states that are massively underfunded, you have to tell me what's the best assumption of what happens to those unfunded liabilities. So my best guess is we're just going to default on them, or partially default on them, which would be a further link to the old. If you say that eventually this is going to be borne by higher payments of the young, then of course this would be I mean, you tell me the assumption of what is going to happen with the unfunded liability, I can tell you what the welfare consequences are.
Taxpayer.
I just have a very hard time sort of predicting what these unfunded liabilities, how they will be dealt.
These are, most of these are public,
Yeah.
so it'll be the taxpayer, it'll be the last.
Supreme Court
It'll be the children of the
What's
taxpayer.
that?
Supreme Court has already gone to Supreme Court as to whether you can reduce those public pensions. Is it a contract that can't be violated? It's an issue.
Okay, the state of California will be the taxpayer. Be specific.
We can adjourn to the
Yes.
wine. Thank you very much.